Okay, we're going to begin by talking about some macro recording basics as well as how to save macro-enabled workbooks. We're going to begin with a new blank workbook. I haven't saved it yet, but we're going to get to that in a minute. And the first thing we're going to want to do is get a more complete set of macro tools on our ribbon. There are some stripped down macro commands underneath the View tab, but this, beyond just very, very simple recording and playing back, this isn't really of much use to us. But what we want is a more complete set of tools that you can get on the Developer tab, which is not showing by default, but you can easily get it. What you're going to do is right-click up on the ribbon and say Customize the ribbon, and then check the Developer option and say OK. And you will now have another tab with a much more complete set of macro tools here. We're not going to use all of these in this course, but we'll move through many of them as we go along. Now, of immediate interest to us are the recording and the stop recording button, which is going to be a toggle switch here. There's another toggle switch beneath it called Use Relative References. This toggles you back and forth between two recording modes, absolute recording mode and relative recording mode. Now, the default is absolute recording. In other words, it's not currently selected. To best understand what this means, we should record a couple of macros that will illustrate it. Now, the only purpose of these macros is to illustrate relative versus absolute recording, so they don't really have any practical purpose beyond that. But what we'll do is, first, we'll resize column A a little bit to allow for a little wider entry here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to record the exact same motion, one using absolute recording and the other one using relative recording. It will make no difference in the recording of the macro what happens, but what you'll see is it'll have implications with how it behaves when you play it back. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, again, let's begin in cell A1 selected, and I'm going to click the Record Macro button. All right. Now, the Record Macro dialog comes up asking me to give the macro a name. So I don't want to go with the default name macro1, so I'm going to call this absolute recording, which is what it's going to be. Beneath that, I can assign a shortcut key if I want to be able to launch this macro from the keyboard. I tend not to do that in here. It's useful for little short utilities and whatnot, but for our purposes, most of our macros are going to be longer and more involved. And we're going to look at better ways to launch them than using the shortcut keys. If you do choose to do this, just make sure that you don't assign a keyboard combination that's already in use. For example, Control X means cut. And if you assign that same key combination, it's going to conflict with the default operation. But you can use modifier keys such as Control Shift X, for example. Now, store macros in where? This workbook, new workbook, personal macro workbook. What do each of these mean? Well, new workbook's simply going to create a new workbook and save the macro into that. That's kind of rare, and we're not going to do that in here at all. Personal macro workbook has some use if you want to save macros into one central repository that will make them available in any workbook that you have open. Now, this is useful for little utilities and things like that you're going to want to use across workbooks. I tend not to use this because what happens, the way this mechanism works, is it saves those macros into a separate workbook that then is open automatically every time you open Excel, but it's hidden. So you don't necessarily see it. But what can happen is if you have other macros later that work across workbooks, that hidden workbook, if you're not mindful of the fact that it's there, can cause some problems. So I tend not to do that. The default of this workbook is usually what you want. It's what we're going to do entirely in this course. We're always going to save the macros into the workbook that we're currently working in. That way the macros travel with the workbook. When you move it to another computer, the macros will go along with the workbook. Okay? Description, you can add an item in there and it'll go into the comments. We'll see what that means in the next module when we talk about comments a little more. But for now, I'm going to click OK. You'll see my recording button becomes a stop recording. toggle switch, and right now it's going to record all of my movements. Now again, I'm in absolute mode, and I'm going to make one move from A1. I'm going to hit the enter key to move me down one cell, and then I'm going to type in the word absolute in A2, and then I'm going to hit enter to complete the entry. That's all this macro is going to do. So I'm going to hit stop recording, and then I'm going to delete that entry from A2, put my active cell back into A1, and I want to record a second macro that makes the exact same motion, but this time I'm going to click use relative reference. So I'll go back up and I'll hit record macro, and I'm going to call this one relative recording. Again, no shortcut key. I'm going to save it into this workbook, and I'm going to say OK. So now, with this toggle switch selected, use relative references, I'm going to make the exact same movement. I'm going to hit enter once to move down one row, and then I'm going to enter the word relative, and then enter again to complete the entry. And then I'm going to hit stop. Now, let's see what happened. I'm going to delete that entry, and I'm going to move over a couple of columns here into D2. It doesn't matter where I start. I just want to start somewhere other than A1. So what I'm going to do now to play back the macro is I'm going to hit the macros button here on the ribbon, and that'll give me a list of the macros I just recorded: absolute recording, relative recording. Now I'm going to begin by playing back absolute recording. When I run it, the cursor jumps over from D2 to A2, and it puts absolute. In other words, it picked up that recording of that movement when I recorded it into A2 as moved specifically into cell A2 as an absolute location. Now, if I delete that entry and I go back to D2 and I play back that second macro, relative recording, what it does is it moves down one row and puts in the word relative. In other words, when I recorded it in A1 as a relative recording, moving down to A2 recorded that movement as move down one row from your current position. Recording it in absolute mode said move into A2, no matter where you are. So that's basically the difference between absolute and relative recording. Once you understand that, you can exploit it, of course, in your macros. Now, which one do you normally use? Well, it depends on the problem, right? Certain kinds of problems are going to require an absolute reference, and some might require a relative. And it is possible in one recording to actually switch back and forth between the modes. But again, this is something that you'll get accustomed to as you practice with this more. And of course, you're encouraged to practice with the macro recorder as we move along. Now, I mentioned before that I haven't saved this workbook yet. So let's do that now and see what happens. All right, so if I go and I say save, and I'm just going to save this into a folder on my desktop, and I'll leave it its default name. If I go and I click save, I'm going to get a warning that says that you can't save the VB project, which is our macros, in a quote macro-free workbook. What does that mean? Well, a macro-free workbook is just a plain old everyday Excel workbook. In other words, it has the extension XLSX. What it's telling you is that you have to save this as a macro-enabled workbook. That is a special type of workbook that is identical to an XLSX in every way, except that this type is allowed to have macros. Why the difference? Well, it's really a security measure. It's one extra layer of security that removes that element of uncertainty when you open a file, because macros can be malicious. In other words, they can be viruses and other types of programs that can do damaging things to your computer. If you're simply opening an XLSX file, in other words, a plain Excel workbook, then you don't have to even worry about it at all, because you know that that particular type of file does not, cannot, will not, has not ever, will not ever contain macros. However, an XLSM file will. So there is an extra layer of security there with that, and also an extra measure of responsibility that comes along with that. But we'll take a look at what I mean by that in a minute. right now I'm just going to simply save that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit from Excel and take a look at the file I just saved on the desktop. Now I saved a plain XLSX file earlier to show you that there is a slight difference in the icon to give you a little visual suggestion that you're dealing with a macro-enabled file here. As well, I also have my extensions displayed in Windows, which is not necessarily the default, but you can do this as one additional visual indicator that this type of file is dealing with macros, and then this one does not. This has one further implication with security when you open the file. If I double click on Book 1 here to open it, you'll see I get a security warning that comes up here and a button that asks me if I want to enable the content. In other words, the macros are not allowed to run, again, in case they're malicious, unless I specifically say that I want to allow them to run. Now in this case, and all of the macros in this course, obviously we know these are safe. There are macros, and we do want them to be able to run. But if you were opening a file from another source, say you received a Office document as an attachment in an email from someone that you either didn't know or someone who doesn't know what macros are, then you should be suspicious if that file contains macros. Now, where is that governed from, that security setting? Well, if you go back to the Developer tab and you see macro security here, this is one way to get into this. You can also get into it from your Excel options. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that, and you'll see that I've got several levels of security here, and this goes in order of increasing scrutiny as you move up. In other words, at the very top is the strictest setting. You're going to disable all macros without notification. In other words, it disables the macros, does not allow them to run, and it doesn't even tell you that there's macros in the workbook. In other words, you're completely removed from the information loop at that setting. In other words, it assumes you probably don't even know what macros are, so therefore we're not even going to tell you they're in there. We're just not going to allow them to run. That's a little extreme. The second level is the default, and it's what I normally use. It disables the macros up front automatically, but it tells you and asks you, do you want to enable the macros or not? This is a suitable and reasonable setting. Again, as long as you know what you're doing, that you may be enabling something that could be risky if it's coming from a source that is unknown or unidentifiable. Now, down here, disable all macros except digitally signed. We're not going to cover that in this course, but what that means is you can add a unique digital signature to macro-enabled files. So for example, within an organization, your IT department, let's say, that produces macro-enabled workbooks specifically for your organization, it can sign them so those will be allowed to run, but others will not. And then finally down here, which is the crazy option, enable all macros, and it simply lets everything run with no scrutiny whatsoever. It doesn't tell you that there's macros in there. This is not recommended according to Microsoft. It's not recommended by anyone I know. So you want to steer clear of that. So those are your macro settings. All right, you're going to need to be comfortable with all of this, the saving macro-enabled workbooks, and working with the tools on your Developer tab. What we're going to do in the next module is now go into the VBA editor and look at the code a little bit more and talk more about what's really happening behind the scenes.